Hello all, I'm not going to bother with the preamble and the shtick today. If you're watching, then odds are you know. Anyway, plus I have a shit ton to do, so I can't faff around. So this week I'll probably do a video on the whole orcs kerfuffle. Otherwise, I've got a ton of layout, freelancing, copy editing, and stuff to do. So I'm going to be too busy doing that to do my regular stuff. Now, mostly the news is the same old, but there's a few updates and a few things I want to touch on, so I will. Sweden is being held up as some sort of example of a different way to go about things. It's being used to excuse calls for ending the lockdown in the United States, or for suggesting that maybe the UK government had the right of it in the beginning and shouldn't have changed their minds and gone with the lockdown. Sweden is its own country with its own geography, its own amount of mixing and so on. There is no full-on lockdown in Sweden. There are some controls, but most people have taken to voluntarily social distancing. So you have to take that into account as well. Sweden being a much more communitarian society, people much more civically minded. So you also have to bear that in mind. Would everyone in other nations self-control their isolation? I think if we look at the States, I think the answer is probably no. About 90% of Swedes are entirely voluntarily staying away from people, wearing masks, not attending big events, not going to bars, all the rest of it. Now, despite all of that, because there is no overall lockdown, Sweden has the worst issues in Scandinavia, which we have to keep in mind. It's much worse than most other Scandinavian nations, which are the best points of comparison to Sweden. So, I mean, what do you want me to tell you? Really, they've chosen a different path. It's not a particularly good path, and they're doing okay because most people are following the rules that other nations have laid down without being prompted. And I don't think that's as true of... Well, let's stick with the UK, shall we? Okay, we're a much more populated, crammed in society. We're not as bad when it comes to lolbitarians as the United States, but we do certainly have a contingent of thickies who are chafing at having to do what other people tell them or having to care about other human beings. And if we didn't enforce social distancing, if we didn't have a shutdown, if we didn't have a lockdown, odds are nowhere near 90% of people would be following the guidelines, which means they'd be infecting people who were following the guidelines. So Sweden, not a terribly good point of comparison. Speaking of the UK, we passed 20,000 official hospital-based deaths in the UK over the weekend, but coroner studies comparing deaths right now with typical deaths for this period in previous years, for which we have accurate records, suggest that 40,000 people have died, and they haven't been going on to the records. And part of the reason for the recent leap in statistics, and this is true of other countries as well, is that the whole confirmation process hasn't gone through, and they're only added to the total once it's confirmed. So you have to keep that in mind. But the UK's death toll is about double of what all the headlines and so on are telling you. And yeah, it's comorbid with stuff. So you say, oh, he didn't die of COVID, he died of a heart attack. But that's a heart attack brought on through the symptoms and strains on the body of COVID. So yeah, it's not disingenuous to say that that death is down to COVID at all. I don't understand why people think that's think that's not the case. I mean, if you crash your car because you're sneezing because of a cold you've got, then really the cold is the cause of death there, not the crash particularly. That's the ridiculous example, but still. Uh, so the domestic violence thing keeps coming up, and it is a problem. It's not that surprising that people are under a great deal more strain, and so there's a lot more potential, both in terms of people having to spend more time around each other and relationships being strained for this sort of thing to go on. But the narrative is very much that this is entirely a gendered problem, when it isn't. Mankind and other similar cash-strapped groups that look after male victims of intimate partner violence and abuse, they reported being stretched almost immediately after the lockdowns and so on were initiated, but we're not having any conversation about male victims, and every attempt to bring it up is consistently met with, the typical world ends women most affected sort of rhetoric that we've come to expect. Excuse me, I haven't been sleeping well. I've got loads of sleep dust. Yuck. Yuck. Yeah, so while I don't doubt that domestic abuse is up, my point is it's up for everybody, and we have much less support structure in place to take care of men. And there are other gendered, even sexist, you could say, issues around intimate partner violence and domestic abuse, in that a woman who kills a man and accuses him of sexual abuse or stabs him in retaliation for assumed or real domestic violence will often get away with it and not end up on the statistics, while the same cannot be said in reverse. As with most of these things, we need genuine, proper statistics to know A, what's going on, and B, what to actually do about it, what could be effective. But at the moment, we're not even acknowledging there is a problem when it comes to men. And yeah, I know, MRA, blah, blah, blah. But, men are suffering, even dying. It's estimated from the few studies that have been done that 40% of the total amount of domestic violence that goes on towards men rather than women, and yet we have something like 1% the support structures in place in terms of safe homes people can go to, telephone line support, financial assistance, all of these kind of things. It's a fucking disgrace. It's not just women, and we need to not forget the other victims, especially when there's so many of them. Italy, some good news, seems to be through the worst of it all, and are thinking about starting to ease restrictions. Now, other nations that have been hit particularly hard are starting to come out the other side. Most economists predict that we will have a pretty swift recovery at the end of all this, as people go back to work, as companies bring people back and rehire them, and as people spend a lot of the money and do a lot of the things that they haven't been able to. At least that would seem to follow the historical model. The only sort of fly in the ointment is that countries are going to be coming out of this in different stages, and also that coming out too soon because of political and social pressure, which seems to be what's going on in the States, could just cause yet another flare-up, and then they would need to double down and restrict everybody again. And it's less likely to go over so well, I expect. There'll probably be more resistance next time. That was another aspect on Sweden that I forgot. Part of Sweden's gamble wasn't to have no shutdown, no social distancing measures or whatever, but to have softer social distancing measures and lockdowns and restrictions that they felt that they could enforce over a longer period. So another thing people are misunderstanding about Sweden is that they are taking measures. They're just taking softer measures that people will be able to accept and live with over a longer period, rather than the kind of short, sharp shock that a lot of other countries have either chosen to do or have been forced into. So that's worth considering as well. But as nations start to move out of it, I think we need to look towards the nations that are most transparent and that show how they've dealt with it, that should have been our model everywhere else, places like South Korea. But also, we need to look at how other countries are coming out of it, because Britain at least is fairly back on the curve there, and see which methods work the best and adapt the ones that work the best within the British context, of course. So with Italy coming out of it, and with other mainland European nations probably set to follow, like Spain and Portugal and so on, we should look to see what happens when they release their lockdowns before we act. So given the infection cycle is 10 to 20 days, so we should observe them for at least a month to decide what we're going to do about releasing the lockdown and so on. But relatively good news. Now, some people have been railing at me for being so down on the American protesters and the demands to remove lockdown, and saying, what about economy and all the rest of it. So I'll briefly digress here to address some of those concerns. Look, if you're an adult and you decide to swallow bleach or whatever, and this is happening, you're an idiot, and I don't feel much reservation in telling you that you're an idiot, and you probably need to be told that you're an idiot. I'm taking that as an example for its topicality, and as a bald example that most people should know is fucking stupid, right? These people asking for the lockdowns to be lifted in the States, even in states where there aren't that many cases and so on, that's equally stupid, right? The infection rate without a lockdown is something like one person infects 3. So you've got one person who infects 3 people. Then each of those people infects another 3 people. So that's another 9 on top, right? And you can see how the exponential curve works there. And without any controls, we would have been looking at about a 60% global infection rate with about a 2% fatality rate, meaning we would lose about 90 million people around the world. And yeah, a lot of them are old or infirm or sick or whatever, and some people seem to be keen to enact some sort of passive eugenics there. Say, oh, well, if we cull the old people, that's not so bad. We don't have to pay out their pensions and so on. It seems a bit heartless to me. And other people are talking about how the impact of austerity and so on will be much higher. What you fail to recognise is that these calls from the United Nations and so on saying that the economic repercussions of all this could kill 150 million people, which is a lot more than 90 million people, that's a call to action. The same as if we don't do something, 90 million people are going to die, is a call to action in relation to the disease, right? So that's if we don't do anything. But let's not assume that we don't do anything. Let's assume that, as with disease, we do something, like we release food stockpiles, or we provide decent PPE and testing and so on for supply chain people and delivery people, frontline people. Then it's going to be a lot less. And as I pointed out previously, a lot of the really impoverished people, there isn't any lower for them to go. They're already picking through garbage. They're already begging. Yeah, things aren't going to get any worse for them. It's just going to be more people in that situation, right? But we can actually examine some figures here. So, again, let's go back to the UK. So the shutdown here does have an impact. But even with the shutdown and so on, we've so far lost about 40,000 people in January, February, March, April. 4 months. Almost getting to the beginning of the 5th month. 40,000 people in 4 months. It's quite a lot of people. Now, austerity, which we didn't have to do and which we don't have to do now, has been attributed as the cause for 100,000 deaths or so over 10 years. So that's 10,000 extra deaths that didn't need to happen due to austerity over 10 years versus 40,000 deaths in 4 months. So 10,000 a year versus 10,000 a month. 10,000 a year that doesn't have to happen this time, didn't have to happen before, versus 40,000, which is the heavily reduced number, right? Let's see, what would have happened if we hadn't locked down? Let me just do the maths here quickly, live. UK population, 66.65 million. So let's call it 66 for ease of maths. Okay, so if we hadn't done anything, 39 million people would have been infected. And we would have lost 500,000 people, as opposed to the 40,000 that we're looking at now. Well, no, more than 500,000, closer to 800,000 people. All right, that's a lot. Now, we did austerity. We didn't have to do austerity. Some Tories are already rumbling about having to bring in more austerity as a reaction to this. It doesn't work. There are other ways of going about things. You don't have to gut the public sector. In fact, historically speaking, the best way to deal with this sort of thing, this sort of looming economic crisis and the problems it will create, is to do the opposite. It's to expand. It's to introduce government programs, to do big infrastructure projects, to bring in welfare systems, as happened in the New Deal in the States, or the NHS here in the UK in the post-war period. And these things work, whereas austerity doesn't. Under austerity, our national debt and so on increased. It's like the adage, you got to spend money to make money, right? If you do these things, and if the money is redirected towards the bottom, right, people who actually have to spend money and do things, and that drives economic activity, whereas it doesn't otherwise. So this UN warning about 150 million people, it's a warning, so we do something about it. Just like 60% infection rate, 2% fatality rate was a warning if we don't do anything about the disease, which we did. So now we have to do something about the potential poverty and starvation that's coming, right? The government and farmers are trying to encourage furloughed or unemployed workers to become fruit pickers. Very few people are taking it up. Unless you're really good at fruit picking, the pay isn't that great. But if you are good at fruit picking, then the pay is great. A lot of people don't live in the right areas to take this up. Yeah, it's a nice idea, but there's all kinds of practicalities and so on that just render it impossible for the vast majority of people, and they're not going to be good enough for a lot of the farmers. Which is why they're flying in people to pick from abroad, which, if you followed the whole Brexit shenanigans, you know that certainly many of us thought that this was obvious that this was what was going to happen. It's just been thrown into sharp relief by the whole coronavirus thing. But if you are off work, and if you do happen to live within probably walking distance of a farm, why not volunteer? Right? Get yourself some PPE, masks and so on are becoming more available privately, and make yourself useful. Why not? It's not suitable for a lot of people. Plus, if you're furloughed and getting 80% of your pay, then topping up with a bit of work and some exercise and so on seems a pretty good bet. The jobless surges and so on. This isn't going to be as long-term terrible. The oil price slump and everything isn't going to be as long-term terrible economically as people are saying, because as countries come back online, a lot of what's been lost is going to be regained pretty goddamn quickly, as compared with other issues. We might see a short-term depression. We will see a short to medium-term recession, but other than that, it's survivable, and there are better ways to go about it than we have done in the past. So the alarmism is unwarranted, whereas when it comes to the disease, the alarmism is warranted. It's this driving innovation as well, not just economic innovation, demands for changes, but actual technological innovation. So various drone companies, particularly concentrated in Australia and other countries with lots of remote areas, like Canada, they've been trialing drones for delivery of supplies, particularly medical supplies, for some time. We now find ourselves with some of these companies trialing using drones, not the quadcopters, like plane drones, to deliver medical supplies from the mainland UK to the Isle of Wight, and similar things are happening elsewhere. So we've seen a big sort of drive for this sort of thing because it avoids a lot of problems with supply chain and so on. So these things might stick around and become more viable options later on. So the world is going to be changed, certainly, but not all in any particularly negative way. And lots of people are saying, look, now is the time to spend money doing things that we should have done before, because we're going to have to spend vast amounts of money on public works and so on if we take that path to get out of this hole. So things like investing massive government spending in renewables, doing a Green New Deal under any other name, yeah, all of these sorts of things. We saw how quickly places like Venice recovered once they were shut down, with the water turning clear and dolphins swimming around. Yeah, nature's more resilient, I think, than we perhaps thought. And if the will is there to tackle things like the coronavirus through sacrifice and spending, then why not do it in these other areas? If we're going to have to do massive social investment and so on, why not spend it in such a way that it improves the world and tackles issues that we should have been dealing with for a long time? So there's a scandal here in the UK. There's an advisory group for the government that's supposed to be made up of scientific advisors, called SAGE, and it was revealed that Dominic Cummings and a couple of other people were on that committee, on that scientific group, that probably shouldn't have been. Why is this a big scandal? Why is this a problem? It's some people have been dismissing this as a conspiracy theory. Look, Dominic Cummings is an ideologue and a political animal. He's not a scientist. His presence on the committee suggests that the committee is compromised and non-scientific, and that the advice coming out of it to the government was affected more by politics than by pragmatism and science. That's why it's a big deal. That's in part probably why the UK government's response was so confused and mixed and fucked up. And that's why it's a scandal. You have to understand that. Yeah, this is what's supposed to be a neutral, independent scientific advisory board, and it's been stacked with political operators, and that's clearly and obviously an issue, I think. One thing that we've all discovered is that a lot of people can work from home very effectively, and that's something that should be changing overall, I think, because it saves on travel, saves money, it makes more marginal jobs more secure without having to up their pay if you don't have to pay out on travel. You know, it reduces carbon emissions, all the rest of it. Schools, it's been interesting to see how they've been tackling this, but there are plenty of kids who can't afford laptops or decent enough smartphones or whatever to do their virtual lessons at home. Various companies and charities have moved in, sort of providing or renting out laptops to kids, but that digital divide is a class and wealth divide, and that's something we're going to have to tackle, and that's been demonstrated now. Right, that's about it. I will look at your questions and stuff now. If there's anything extra you want to ask me about or whatever, right, we'll get to it. Morning, Ben. Morning, Sonic. Yeah, keeping well. I think this is pretty much normal for me anyway. A little bit strained, but the reason I've been so combative about this conspiracy nonsense and about the libertarians demanding things open up is because this isn't just academic, though I'm convinced by the academic statistics anyway, but it's also personal. I have shit lungs. I may have already had this and gotten over it, may not have, it was very mild if it was, but I have shit lungs, and if I do get it, I'm pretty high risk. My nephew is pretty high risk due to some underlying health issues he has. Several of my friends are high risk because they people who've recovered from cancer and have suppressed immune systems. I've got disabled friends. My parents are getting on a bit, so they're pretty high risk. Fortunately, my dad's pretty isolated, and my mum's sensible about following orders and science to stay isolated. But it's not purely academic. It will directly affect me. People's stupidity will directly affect me. The conspiracy nonsense about 5G towers, or Bill Gates wanting to microchip people, or people demanding to be let out. It's the same stupidity that lies behind anti-vaccination people. If it only affected you, fine, be stupid, catch a disease and die. That's just Darwinism in action, right? But it doesn't work like that. Like we said, one person infects 3 people, infects 9 people, infects 27 people, and so on. And pretty rapidly, you're going to infect people outside that pool of assholes. So, I mean, what do you want me to say here? Your stupidity is threatening my life, my friends' lives, my family's lives. And even if we're the most careful possible, all it takes is a handful of stupid people. It's why they shouldn't lift the restrictions in the States, even in the States where there's not that many infections, because rather rapidly there would be, and there's a lag of 10 days and so on. So don't expect me to be particularly merciful to anybody here, because you're directly threatening my life, and I really wish you wouldn't. Am I making a video today about the RPG Orc argument? Like I say, I've got a ton of stuff to do, so probably won't be a lot of videos this week, because I need to sacrifice the time I spend doing videos to do other things. But there will still be the game sessions on this channel in the evenings. So it's Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, hopefully, unless other stuff comes up. So this video and one on the orcs, and then I probably won't be doing much else. Ben also says people working from home could help the housing crisis too, to some degree. I mean, the people would have more money, the people that don't have to travel. I mean, if you work in a call center, there's no need for you to go into an office, right? And a lot of work is that sort of thing: sales calls, cold calls, manning the phones. There's no reason why that can't be directed to people's home phones and so on. It would save them money, which means they would be less likely to fall behind on their rent and all the other issues. So I guess it could there. It would have to be coupled with additional housing security. It's been interesting how suddenly we've managed to find ways to house all these homeless people that have been around for years and years and years, just because they suddenly pose a threat to our health. Right, I best get on. I'll try and do that orc video, and then otherwise I'm probably going to be fairly quiet this week, so just a heads up. Hope you and yours are keeping well. Hope you don't live near any idiots. Yeah, stay well, stay safe, stay indoors, and I'll see you all later. Zang.